Right, so let's go over to the female reproductive system where we're going to look at a lot more detail. So the focus here is along. Okay, so first and foremost, females have 2 ovaries, glandular, meaning that these things release hormones. And we mentioned right at the beginning now, the 2 hormones that are released here are estrogen and progesterone. So these are actually the reproductive structures within the female reproductive system, because not only do the ovaries produce the female hormones, but they also produce ova, which are the female gametes, the sex cell of a female. So let's look at a section through the ovaries to understand this process a little bit better. So here we have an enlargement of an ovary, and we have a fallopian tube and a section of the uterus visible. Now, something that's a bit different between boys and girls is that boys start producing sperm from puberty and they never stop until the day that they die. So their testosterone levels are fairly high during certain parts of their life and go down towards older age, but they never stop producing sperm. Women, on the other hand, we are born with a certain amount of primary follicles that are capable of producing egg cells. And at the start of puberty, with the first menstruation, we basically start counting down. So every month when you ovulate, you are losing egg cells, and therefore at some point in your life, you run out of them. And seeing as this ovary, in its production of the egg cell, produces the estrogen that makes you a female and that allows your whole menstrual cycle to function, if the ovaries stop producing egg cells, then they also stop producing estrogen. So that's a stage of life which we call menopause, when the ovaries shut down for business and they're no longer producing egg cells and no longer producing the female reproductive hormones. So women aren't fertile for their entire lifespan. You only have what is often referred to as a biological clock, which is ticking down. So if we look at the process here, we say that, right, so the ovaries usually take turns once a month. So you have 2 of them. 1 month it's the left ovary, the other month the right ovary to produce ova. And sometimes both ovulate, and that's how you actually get non-identical twins. So at the start, we have primary follicles that develop into what is known as Graafian follicles, which is this large follicle containing an immature ovum, and the process through which this Graafian follicle forms and the ovum inside is part of meiosis, and we'll quickly look at that a bit later. So basically, these primary follicles, once a month, one of them will go into this phase, start developing, growing into a secondary and then a tertiary follicle, and eventually have this beautiful Graafian follicle with the ovum inside that is ready to be ovulated. On and about day 14, when LH levels peak, ovulation will happen, where that ovum now is released into the fallopian tube, and you can see that happening there. So only the ovum is released, and what's left of the Graafian follicle will now change into a corpus luteum, which is this yellow body we see in the ovary that's responsible for producing the progesterone, which helps to maintain this endometrium if pregnancy does occur. So here's just a very nice section through an ovary to actually show you the real stuff. So you can see the beautiful primary follicles all sitting here just anxiously waiting to become ova. And then here you can see a secondary follicle, so one of these that has now committed to becoming an ovum or carrying an ovum. It's grown a little bit with the immature ovum on the inside and then these beautiful follicular cells on the outside. And here you can see a mature Graafian follicle, which has this kind of fluid-filled cavity here called an antrum, which allows this to burst, and then it propels this immature ovum into the fallopian tube, and hopefully, if you want to, you can get pregnant if a sperm cell is available. So now, if fertilization does occur, it's the right time of the month, you did have sexual intercourse, then the corpus luteum will remain intact and you will not menstruate. So we don't want to shed this endometrium if you have had that ovum fertilized, because it needs somewhere to implant and to grow. However, if no fertilization takes place, then the ovum, which has now not been fertilized, together with this endometrium will be shed during menstruation. And the reason for this is that the corpus luteum starts disintegrating. You can see here it becomes smaller and it eventually disappears. So the hormones that it's producing to sustain that endometrium is no longer in play. And that then signals the start of a new cycle for the next month. And we'll do the menstrual cycle in depth a bit later. So now, how are ova exactly made? What do I need to know for exams? So like Yolandi mentioned, gametogenesis is the production of gametes through meiosis. Spermatogenesis specifically relates to the production of sperm. Oogenesis now relates to the production of females. And here you can see a micrograph of a beautiful egg cell, and then they enlarge it a little bit to show you that little sperm cell who's got his head through for fertilization. So let's take a closer look at oogenesis. Now, immediately here, you can see some differences between the oogenesis and the spermatogenesis cycle. So where we had a diploid cell in males, the spermatogonium, going through 2 processes of meiosis, number 1 and number 2, and 4 haploid sperm cells being formed, in females, this is different. The whole point of producing an ovum is to make it as viable as possible. So every time at the end of meiosis, when we go through the telophase phase and you have the cytoplasm dividing, the majority of the cytoplasm will go to one of the daughter cells, producing a polar body on the other side. This again happens at the end of meiosis 2. So this daughter cell, when it divides, will push most of the cytoplasm towards this mature or immature, fully formed ovum that can now sustain a developing embryo, and you have the polar bodies that form. So now one diploid cell produces one haploid cell instead of 4. And that's because the cytoplasm here kind of acts like a yolk, kind of sustaining the embryo. So again, we want to make sure that this is a very healthy, viable egg cell. So as much as cytoplasm as possible goes to one developing ovum. Now, this process is not controlled by estrogen, as testosterone would control it in men. Instead, it's controlled by a hormone FSH, which I mentioned stands for follicle stimulating hormone, meaning it stimulates a follicle to develop. So it's obviously related to the development of this ovum as well. This process occurs in the ovaries the same way that spermatogenesis occurs in the testes. And then that important difference is that one haploid ovum develops instead of 4. So once again, have your exam guideline handy, because a lot of terminology goes into textbooks and they talk about primary oocytes and secondary oocytes, and we're not going to go into that detail because this is the gist of it. This is what you would write if they asked you for 4 or 5 marks to discuss oogenesis. So oogenesis, where does it occur? In the ovaries, and it's influenced and controlled by the hormone FSH. And what does it entail? It entails a diploid cell, that primary follicles, first undergoing mitosis to form more numerous follicles, and then one of these will undergo meiosis, inside which an egg cell will form. So one cell inside the follicle undergoes meiosis to form 4 cells. There you can count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, of which only one survives to produce the mature haploid ovum. So that's a very important distinction between oogenesis and spermatogenesis. Now, just like you had to know the structure of the sperm cell, you also need to know the structure of an egg cell, and you also need to be able to draw it. So on the next slide, what we have is a beautiful ovum, and in exams, always make sure which of these different layers are actually provided. So let's go through them to see where they are. So right on the inside, we have the nucleus of the egg cell, which carries the genetic information of the female. So this will be the female information, and the sperm will carry the male information. And during fertilization, these two combine to form a beautiful human being. Then we have the cytoplasm, which is the fluid part here in which all the organelles will be, and it acts as kind of like a yolk, as I mentioned, to support the development of the embryo. And that's why we want to ensure that the ovum that is ovulated has as much of this as possible. And then around that cell membrane, on the outside of the cytoplasm, we have this jelly layer, which is also sometimes referred to as the zona pellucida. And this jelly layer is the layer through which the acrosome of the sperm cell needs to enter, and provides to some extent protection to the egg cell as well. And in some exams, they also include pictures of the follicular cells. So those are the cells that are left over from the Graafian follicle. Once it has burst open, it pulls some of those follicular cells, called the corona radiata, with it into the fallopian tube. But be careful when you get a picture of an egg cell. They don't always include the follicular cells. So make sure, am I looking at cells, individual like round cells around the sides with nuclei, or are the labels only indicating the nucleus, the cytoplasm, and this jelly layer on the outside? Okay.
Marika, I just quickly want to interrupt you. It's a very good point that you've made there regarding the diagram, because now they don't always indicate it as little tiny follicular cells. Sometimes they put like darker rings around the central nuclei. And I always tell my learners to start labeling from the inside out, and then if you've got an additional ring that you haven't labeled yet, then that will be the follicular cells.
Good advice.
So yeah, definitely, as Marika said, just be careful when you label that one.
Okay. Right, and then continuing on with the structures of the female reproductive system. So we've done the ovaries now, the main reproductive organs producing not only the hormones but the actual gametes. Now we have that ovum being released into this fallopian tube. And again, there are two of them. And the fallopian tube has three functions. Firstly, this is usually where fertilization happens. So if sperm has been deposited in the vagina at the right time of the month, before ovulation, they would swim up here, hopefully go down the right fallopian tube to meet the egg cell, and then fertilization tends to happen in this area. Then if fertilization happens, this would also be the pathway for the dividing zygote to actually find its way to the uterus. And we refer to a dividing zygote as an embryo. We'll recap these terms again a bit later. And then obviously, being that this is where fertilization happens, the fallopian tubes is also this pathway from which the sperm cells actually enter and meet the egg cell. Then the uterus itself is just a hollow muscular organ, and it can stretch quite a lot to accommodate the developing fetus. In fact, did you know that as a female that has not had a child before, your uterus is about the size of the palm of your hand, and it can stretch massively to accommodate that developing fetus. So hopefully that shocks you a bit. So if you continue here on the slide, you can see a hollow structure, but it has a very important membrane there called the endometrium. And that's what builds up every month and becomes nice and vascular, nice and blood rich, so that it provides a space for the blastocyst to implant and the placenta to form, so that there's an exchange platform for nutrients. As a hollow structure, it not only helps to protect the fetus during gestation, but gives a space for it to grow as well. And this uterus consists of a thick muscle layer that can powerfully contract to push that fetus out through the cervix and the vagina during the birth process. Now, this endometrium itself is going to build up every month during the menstrual cycle. And if you do not get fertilized that month, you can see here in the animation, the unfertilized egg cell, the ovum, as well as this endometrium, this blood-rich layer, is shed through the vagina as blood. And that's what we refer to as menstruation. So that happens in a monthly cycle when fertilization has not happened. Then we have the cervix here at the bottom, which is just the opening between the vagina and the uterus, and it stretches immensely again to accommodate the fetuses moving out during childbirth. When you watch documentaries or series and they talk about a woman being X amount of centimeters dilated, it's referring to how far that cervix has stretched already. And then the vagina is just a muscular tube that receives the penis during sexual intercourse, and it also serves as the birth canal through which the birthing process happens. So through that little hole, you have to push a watermelon, girls. It's also the passage for menstrual blood during menstruation, as I've mentioned. So far we've talked about a bunch of different hormones.